Hi everyone, welcome back. And in this particular screencast for Anthropology and World Problems at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania, we'll be taking a look at migration. So overall, some big questions and overview to think about. Why move? We might have the opportunity to move to a particular town such as Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, for example, and that might be for things like attending university. This is, of course, a very different type of thing than if you have a forced migration or structural economic factors are in essence forcing you to migrate to new areas. And we've talked a little bit about this, and I'll address some of the areas that we have touched on so far in these screencasts in Anthropology and World Problems. So one of the questions that arises, of course, is, how is migration thought about, and what should be done to encourage or prevent migration or movement of people, and who should act and at what level, how have different agencies and entities acted, and then how are migrants perceived both in their home country as well as their host country. So we'll start out with a general coverage of historical migration coming from anthropology as a whole. We'll look at urbanization, we'll look at remittances, and specifically Kane's work in 2010 in Senegal. We'll then look at forced migration and Anderson's work in Spain, and looking at prevention of so-called unwanted flows. And we've talked about these flows in the context of globalization as well. So as a review of where we've been in these screencasts in Anthropology and World Problems, the subjects have a lot of connection here with what we have covered in the class. The U.S.-Mexico border issues that we talked about with the Tohono Nation, which shares 70 miles of border between the United States and Mexico. And of course, this became a real flashpoint in terms of building a border wall, and what that would look like across a nation, a Native American nation, the Tohono. And the notion there when I did my field work of illegals. But at the same time, there were also folks that were doing things like humanitarian water drops, because the Sonoran Desert, of course, is incredibly brutal in terms of the weather swings between hot and cold overall. We looked at, in the context of Hurricane Katrina, and you can see this image here, what some geographers have dubbed the Katrina diaspora, or essentially forced movement after Hurricane Katrina. And of course, a lot of this had to do with remaking the city as well as the gentrification of the city. And so when we think about Hurricane Katrina, we could think about things like paths of opportunity versus paths of desperation. It's a lot different situation moving to Arizona or Alaska or Pennsylvania to follow one's career in anthropology, for example, than it is to be forced to move because the place that you were living in no longer exists. In Alaska, we looked at the push-pull factors that went in to influence how people decided to move from rural to urban areas in the context of the heat or eat crisis as a circumstance which exacerbated that issue. And we also talked about, in the context of climate change, Robin Broden's work on climigration, or migration due to climate change as well. We looked at conservation-based displacement in the Masai Mara Reserve. This is Bleal Butt's work. We talked about development-based displacement in the context of Centralia, Pennsylvania, as well as Tox Island Dam. Basically consequences of energy development, and then later park development for the Tox Island Dam, now the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, and potentially soon Delaware Water Gap National Park. Of course, there's a lot of controversy surrounding that right now, with the No National Park movement locally. The story of migration, of course, is the story of our species. And this right here documents the out of Africa hypothesis of the movement of one species across the globe, our species, and our movement to basically populate the entire world. And so these places become new at particular times and places. And I must say that this map's interesting because, of course, it leaves out this entire vastness of Oceania, right? Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, all in here, just sort of left off of the map, which of course is interesting regarding ideas of land and perception, but that's a story for a different time. In terms of movement overall, we are also seeing an increased trend in urbanization, a continuing trend, as well as a growth of megacities. And megacities are those cities with 10 million or more inhabitants. Tokyo currently is the world's largest city with 37 million inhabitants. New Delhi follows this with 29 million. But the growing trend of New Delhi and the shrinking trend of Tokyo mean that, according to projections, by 2028, New Delhi will be the largest city in the world. Shanghai is currently 26 million. This is 2018 data, the most recent that I could locate. Mexico City, Sao Paulo, each with around 22 million. Cairo, Mumbai, Beijing, Dhaka all have close to 20 million inhabitants. By 2030, the world is projected to have 43 megacities with more than 10 million inhabitants. Most of these will be in developing regions. Currently, 1 in 8 people live in 33 megacities worldwide, with close to half of the world's urban dwellers residing in much smaller settlements with fewer than half a million inhabitants. And again, this is all UN World Urbanization Prospects, the 2018 revision. The revision before this was 2011. Okay, so currently there are 33 megacities on Earth, and here you can see their distribution and the projection by 2030 of where the megacities will develop, where these current cities will reach over 10 million inhabitants if current trends continue. In a global world, of course, we have the movement of people and goods as well as the movement of money. And so this idea of remittances is returning money back to a home country or destination in the context of migration. This could also be potentially within a country as well, but here we're looking specifically at inflows and outflows of remittances. So flows to low and middle income countries are expected to increase by 4.2% in 2022 to reach a record $630 billion US. This follows an almost record recovery of 8.6% in 2021, according to the World Bank's latest Migration and Development Brief, which you can see here on the right, and is featured on the next 3 slides. Remittances to Ukraine, which is the largest recipient in Europe and Central Asia, are expected to rise by over 20% in 2022. However, remittance flows to many Central Asian countries, for which the main source is Russia, will likely dramatically fall. This, coupled with increased costs of necessary supplies for ensuring food security, mean that the situation in these countries is likely to be dire over the 2022-2023 timeframe. Globally, and again, this is all coming from that same report here, the average cost of spending $200 was 6% in the fourth quarter of 2021. This is double in the target Sustainable Development Goal target of 3%, according to the World Bank's Remittances Prices Worldwide Database. According to Dilap Ratha, the lead author of this report and head of KNOMAD at World Bank, lowering remittance fees by 2 percentage points would potentially translate to $12 billion of annual savings for international migrants from low and middle income countries and 400 million for migrants and refugees from Ukraine. The top 5 recipient countries for remittances by US dollar value were India, Mexico, China, the Philippines, and then Egypt in 2021. Mexico moved up, replacing China at the number 2 spot here. In terms of relation to the gross domestic product of country, we can see very high remittance inflows in Lebanon at 54%, Tonga at 44%, Tajikistan at 34%, and you can read down the list here. But again, these are, if you're not familiar with this information, can be quite shocking in terms of the amount of money and resources that need to be moving into a particular country. And of course, this is one in the context of push-pull factors in terms of having income. This is the reason why that many folks will leave their home country and move to a host country which might be less than hospitable to them. So Kane's 2010 Work, Charity, and Self-Help, Migrant Social Networks and Healthcare and Homeland looks at some of the underlying policies that led to migration in Africa and specifically in West Africa. So Kane notes that in the 1980s and 1990s, through the imposition of structural adjustment policies in Africa, and these are essentially austerity measures where to service loans, the amount spent on social services is dramatically decreased. This, coupled with currency devaluation, really impacted people in terms of their economic stability. What we saw during this time, too, according to Kane, was a withdrawal of the state and privatization. And of course, this is something that we see in a variety of different locations. We can consider privatization of essential services in terms of delivery of things like water services, trash services, sanitation services in general, and then private, and also in the context of food security. So the increase in food banks overall as the state retreats further and further away. In the Senegal River Valley, remittances are essential for survival. Migra dollars or migra euros. Remittances are more prevalent in West Africa compared to Central and East Africa. And then the migrants are honored as cultural heroes in these different settings. And so this is, I would argue, this is a structural movement here. What we have with forced migration, and these are statistics are a little bit lower, but you'll be able to see the contrast with some updated information in the next slide here. So forced migration due to conflict, 51 million people. This was at its highest level since World War II, driven by natural disasters affecting 22 million people. And then forced displacement is a humanitarian issue, but is also a major development issue for both the origin and destination countries, with impacts on growth, employment, and public spending. 9 out of 10 refugees were being hosted in developing countries, and this trend is largely still true at the end of 2013, with Pakistan and Iran the largest of these hosts. Many refugees and internally displaced people are living in protracted situations of displacement, meaning they're living there for multiple years in some instances. In 2013, an estimated 2/3 of the world's refugees had been in exile for more than 5 years, and half of them were children. So pretty astounding numbers. Unfortunately, the situation has gotten worse. The total number of internally displaced persons by conflict and violence as of December 31st, 2021, you can see very high rates here in Syria, with 53.2 million just internally displaced people in 59 countries. The DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo, at 5.3 million, and then you have Afghanistan and Yemen, and also in the Americas, Colombia at 5.2 million internally displaced people. So quite an extent of IDPs throughout the globe.